Hello, folks. Welcome to another episode of the Philosophy Salon. On tonight's episode of the Philosophy Salon, we're going to be discussing a topic which is particularly relevant to our current times we're living in, and this is the topic of war. And specifically, we're going to be discussing the metaphysical, the psychological, and the political nature of war. And our focus is going to be on an examination of three philosophical theses. The first is that war is metaphysical in nature. The second is that war is psychological in nature. And finally, that war is political in nature. And in examining these theses, we do not mean to suggest that they're mutually exclusive, but interdependent. War is metaphysical, psychological, and political in a unitive sense. In addressing each of these theses regarding the nature of war, we will offer our own unique evaluations of each, and we'll be weighing and considering the arguments and evidence in support of each. So, why discuss war to begin with? Well, since time immemorial, human beings have been at war with one another at various times and places in our evolution, from ancient Babylon up until recent times with the war in Gaza. So to gain better insights into war and its multifaceted nature, its causes, its relationship to human psychology, and its relationship to peace, a detailed philosophical investigation into these topics would provide fruitful. So to begin, let's first orient ourselves to the discussion by gaining a better understanding of what war is. And let's first of all examine the definition of war. And the first thing it's worthwhile to talk about is the origins of the word itself. And according to the Oxford English Dictionary, the word war comes from the Frankish word wera, meaning discord and strife. And as to the definition itself, it could be defined, war could be defined in a twofold sense. So in the one sense, it could be defined in a militaristic sense as a hostile contention by means of armed forces carried on between nations and states or rulers or between parties in the same nation or state. And it involves the employment of armed forces against foreign powers or against an opposing army. And then there's an alternative but related definition of war, which takes on a more poetical and theoretical meaning. And it's applied to any kind of act of hostility or contention between living beings or of a conflict between opposing forces. And both the etymology and definitions of war will be relevant to understanding the nature of war and all of its aspects throughout our discussion. So bear them in mind. Now, Ryan, do you think that's a fairly succinct formulation of what war is, just as far as the definition goes? Is there anything else that strikes you as being a particular aspect of war that those definitions leave out at this stage?
No, but I think it's important to keep in mind the poetical and theoretical meaning. And, sometimes I think we'll be kind of speaking about both at the same time. We might kind of interchange the two. So just kind of pay attention for that. But yeah, I think a lot of what we'll be talking about relates to both of those at the same time. So yeah, keep an eye out for that.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. Yeah, it's going to be a common theme throughout our discussion. Both senses of the word, the military meaning and the poetical meaning. So bear those in mind. But to return to our main thread of our discussion, let's examine the first of these theses. And this is the metaphysical theses, which we could state briefly as follows. War is a part of the fundamental nature, constitution, and structure of reality. And this thesis by no means begins in the Western philosophical tradition, but precedes philosophy and is anticipated by ancient mythology. Although the mythological accounts of war do have philosophical significance and meaning, so they're by no means not philosophical. They're just portraying the philosophical in the symbology of myth. So we see metaphysical war in ancient mythology, perhaps most clearly in Homer's Iliad. And Homer's Iliad is perhaps the foremost myth in Western thought that propounds the view that war is part of the metaphysical fabric of human affairs, but also divine and cosmic affairs as well. In the Iliad, we see war portrayed as the conflict between opposing forces, particularly the conflict between change and permanence. For instance, there's no permanence for Achilles, nor for Hector, nor for Agamemnon, all central characters within the poem. This lack of permanence and this persistence of perpetual flux is precipitated in the Iliad by the fickleness of the gods, who might be considered the representatives of permanence, change, and stability and being. And it's their fickleness and their quarrels that precipitate and maintain the war. So in short, the divine, the pantheon of gods, represent the principle of the origin of what is permanent in the world, but paradoxically the origin of the radical flux of the world. And the conflict between the divine forces of permanence and the radical flux that they originate in the world is the metaphysical war that is the fundamental condition of reality. So while Homer's Iliad provided a mythic account of the warlike nature of reality, in which the gods govern the opposition between stability and change that is definitive of war, Heraclitus, who preceded Homer and the Greek mythological poets, he provided a philosophical account that was more explicitly metaphysical. So it sought to explain metaphysical war, the perpetual opposition between stability and change, by appealing to philosophical principles, particularly his first principle, which is known as the logos. So it is to a consideration of Heraclitus' theory of metaphysical war that I now want to turn. But briefly, Ryan, I'm just curious to get your take on war as it's portrayed in the myths. Have you given some consideration to the mythic expression of war? Do you feel like what I have gone over is a good representation of war in the sense that we'll be discussing?
Yeah, I think it's probably the one most central to like the Western canon. I think Homer's Iliad is probably one of the most notable. I think you can also see it too, just in the Bible. You know, the conflict between good and evil, God and Satan, that kind of thing as well. So you could take that route and look at the Bible. There's so many different cultures that have this distinction. So the one thing that I find interesting is it seems like Heraclitus is moving towards something more secular,
Right.
something in essence less Greek.
Right.
So that's something perhaps to note there. So he's trying to provide an explanation of this warlike nature of reality without appealing to Greek gods.
Right. Yes. No, I think these are good observations you point out. The example of the Bible, insofar as we want to consider the Bible as portraying this myth in which the unity of opposites plays out, I think is a excellent example, and one that is especially relevant to our North American, Judeo-Christian culture, which kind of forms the backdrop of a lot of our institutions and, even just ethical worldviews. And, I think it underscores the just how thoroughly imbued this conception of war as this unity of opposites just kind of underscores how pervasive that is within our society, almost to the point where I think we take it for granted, but it's there. And I think this conflict between good and evil, between between say God and Christ and Satan and his minions is particularly appropriate in this case. And then as to the secularness of Heraclitus' thought, yeah, I agree. I mean, when we look at the development of Western philosophy, generally we say philosophy first, in the sort of the pure sense comes into being with the beginning of the pre-Socratics, precisely because they do away with invoking divinities and gods to do the explaining. They seek to replace the gods with first principles and naturalistic explanations. So yes, that's another good observation too. So to avoid digressing too much, let's get back onto the main path here and return to this issue of metaphysical war in ancient Greek philosophy. And let's turn to a discussion in particular on Heraclitus' logos and the principle of the unity in opposites and the process of cosmic justice and strife, which I think are central to the discussion. So let me briefly just state Heraclitus' thesis. So Heraclitus argues that war is metaphysical insofar as the cosmos is governed by the conflict between opposing forces, which beneath the apparent conflict is an underlying unity that is knowable. And it is knowable by virtue of the logos, a concept that is rich and complex in meanings in ordinary Greek speech. And Heraclitus' use of the word implicitly and explicitly draws upon these meanings. So these meanings may be stated as follows. The logos is, first, an account or a story of the way things are, an account that involves that which we can say and express in words. And it can also be understood as a right reckoning and as reasonable proportion, as the ancient Greek scholar Guthrie pointed out. And for Heraclitus, the logos, moreover, takes on a specialized meaning as well. The logos, for him, is the unity that pervades reality, a moving or a flowing unity. And the logos is the unity that makes the perception of reality as a process of perpetual flux intelligible. So it is through the logos that we can grasp the unity in opposites that is a fundamental feature of reality. And just as a side note, what makes the logos an authoritative source of knowledge is that it can be accessed by everybody, which is to say it's impersonal, it's universal, it's impartial. It's something like the laws of the city, if you want to think of that analogy. So that is briefly Heraclitus' thesis regarding metaphysical war. Now, let's turn to a discussion of, well, first of all, let me just take a pause there, Ryan. Are you okay with everything that I've just said here? Does it make sense? Do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, I think that is a good summary so far. At this stage, I'm always like a bit fuzzy on what the logos means, and like my intuition always goes towards thinking that the logos and wars in some sense the same thing. Like if you can understand the conflict or the war between two things, you can understand how they're really connected and unified.
Right.
I'm not sure if Heraclitus would agree with that assessment, but that's sort of where I lean to is, once you really understand what the conflict is about, you understand that they're two sides of the same coin.
Right. Yeah, no, I think I would agree with that interpretation. I feel like the principle of the logos is it's a dynamical principle, right? On the one hand, it's it's a it's a principle which is apparently unchanging in some sense, insofar as from situation to situation there is this logos that makes things comprehensible to us, but that logos also by its very nature is changing as well. With regards to the opposing forces that it seeks to that it gives us a knowledge and understanding of. So there is that. Even in understanding the logos itself, there seems to be this unity of opposites. The logos in one sense is this sort of, seems to be this unchanging principle of intelligibility that applies across different situations, but it also seems to change from situation to situation as well, depending on the phenomena we're looking at.
It does kind of remind me of Levinas a little bit, and how there's this fundamental distinction between self and other.
Mm-hmm.
And once you realize that the two are dependent on one another, and in particular, the self is dependent on the other, and on that conflict, and like you said, depending on the phenomena, depending on what self and other you're dealing with, it's going to manifest differently.
Yes, yeah, exactly, right. So I think it's just pointing out another instance of this unity of the opposites we see pervading reality, and you see it sort of at the most fundamental level of the principle of intelligibility itself. But in any case, I don't want to digress too much. But that's Heraclitus' thesis regarding metaphysical war. Now to turn to metaphysical war and the principle of the unity of opposites as it's found in everyday life and everyday experience, Heraclitus has some interesting examples. So throughout Heraclitus's writings, which are handed down to us now in fragments, the pre-Socratics famously wrote in fragments and short aphorisms. His fragments are replete with examples from everyday life of the apparently opposing forces in nature that, beneath the surface appearances, have an underlying unity. So he famously writes, and I'm going to quote now, "Those who step into the same river have different waters flowing ever upon them." That's fragment 12. To continue quoting, "The way up and down is one and the same." That is fragment 60. And then again, to continue with quoting, "Disease makes health pleasant and good, hunger satisfaction, weariness rest, weariness and rest." So these examples within everyday experience we encounter are opposites that are not entirely opposed and distinct. And these opposites are, in actuality, within our everyday experience. And as the scholar Gussie points out, they are co-present. This is him quoting. They're co-present, they are interdependent, and they are liable to change into one another, tacitly cooperating. So just to restate that again, because I think it's he sort of captures succinctly the nature of this relationship. He says, "These opposites are, quote, co-present, interdependent, liable to change into one another, tacitly cooperating." So bear that in mind as we continue along in trying to account for this relationship between opposites and their underlying unity. Consider the above examples and consider the unity of opposites at play. So fragment 12 that I mentioned basically what it's saying is that one cannot step into the same river unless its waters are ceaselessly changing. Fragment 60, which I mentioned, basically says the way up, say, a road or a mountain, is not possible unless there is simultaneously a way down these things. And fragment 111 essentially says if there was no such thing as disease, then one could never enjoy health, nor could health even exist. So I think these capture the notion of this unity of opposites fairly concretely and in ways that are relatable to our everyday experience. Does this how is this settling with you, Ryan, at this stage? Does this make sense? Does the relationship between the opposing forces, do you think it's properly accounted for?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's almost predicting, some of the laws of thermodynamics a little bit. Every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. Sort of like understanding that relationship between cause and effect.
Right.
So it's in a way it's sort of elucidating the principle without being able to really state it in words.
Right.
Like I find like it's giving you examples, but it's not really able to state the relationship concretely.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's a good observation. I think it also points out perhaps a limitation to the depth of explanation of Heraclitus's examples and of his fragments. There's a great deal of generality in them, and not much specification as to the actual causal relationships, I suppose, between the opposing forces. What is it that causally relates one force to another force? Perhaps sort of the seedlings for an answer are present in Heraclitus, but maybe it's up to later thinkers and philosophers and scientists to specify what the exact causal processes involved are. And we can get into that a little bit towards the end of this section. I have my own reflections on how modern science validates a lot of Heraclitus's theoretical constructs in this regard. But I don't want to digress too much into that at this stage. Perhaps we can continue on with the flowing unity of our discussion. So, metaphysical war, now stated as a general metaphysical principle. So, we've kind of talked about metaphysical war in the concrete and in the particular, but let's now investigate it in the more metaphysical and abstract sense. So from these everyday examples noted above, Heraclitus formulates the unity of opposites as a general metaphysical principle, which he perhaps most succinctly summarizes in fragment 51. Quote, "They do not understand how that which differs with itself is in agreement. Harmony consists of opposing tension, like that of the bow and the lyre." So let's offer some interpretations of this fragment. So the principle at play here is that there is a harmony in opposing forces, as it is the case with the bow and the lyre. So in particular, implicit in this principle is the idea that the unity is more fundamental than the opposites. So such an idea would seem to be consistent with Heraclitus's monistic view that, quote, "all things are one," unquote. And that's fragment 50. Heraclitus is suggesting that this underlying unity is produced by a harmony among the components of a structure, as is the case with the structure of the bow and the lyre. Also implicit in this principle, moreover, is the idea that the opposites are essential components of the unity. So regarding these opposites, the pre-Socratic scholar Hussey aptly notes, quote, "their presence is the essence of the unity," unquote. And this unity in question here is a unity with a purpose or a function. That is, a functional unity. The function of a bow is that it is a device designed to launch a projectile, an arrow, and this function is enabled by the opposing tension of the bowstring when it is drawn back with the hand and arrow, and the ensuing vibration of the bowstring when the arrow is cocked back, and launched. The function of the lyre is that it's an instrument for producing a musical melody, and this function is enabled by the opposing tension of the pulling back of the strings, the vibration of the strings, the up and down movement of the melody. The manifestations of the opposites involves a process in which the unity performs an essential function. In each case, the functional unity of these artifacts is enabled by the opposites inherent in the components of their structure. So that's perhaps articulating this relationship between the opposites and what it is that unifies these opposites. It would seem there's a functional unity, a unity between the components of each opposing force, each opposing thing. I think Heraclitus, the metaphor of the bow and the lyre, I think is particularly apt for explaining that. So that's Heraclitus on the unity of opposites as this basic metaphysical principle. And I'd like to now dovetail into a discussion of our own views on the matter. And I'd like to raise some questions about metaphysical war. And these can just be thought of as philosophical problems. We don't need to get to the bottom of each of these, but I think they're worth considering. Just to ponder more generally. And but some questions we could raise are, does metaphysical war exist as Heraclitus has characterized it? Is there a conflict or a unity of opposing forces that is a fundamental part of the cosmos or the cosmic process? And if so, what evidence or justification might support this metaphysical war theory? So I'll briefly offer my own stance on the issue, which is that I think that metaphysical war and the theory behind it is supported by what we know from our modern scientific worldview. And we see conflicts between unities, between opposing forces in many natural phenomena that have been demonstrated by empirical experimentation in science at various scales in nature, including the micro and the macro. And so on the more micro scale, we see that, within physics, there is a conflict between opposing forces manifested in the electric charge of matter. And here we see metaphysical war manifest on a physical scale. The electric charge of matter can be characterized as a conflict between opposing forces, that is, a conflict between positive and negative electric charges. And physics and electrodynamics in particular demonstrates that like charges repel each other, while unlike or opposing charges attract one another. For instance, a positively charged atom will attract a negatively charged atom, while atoms of the same charge will repel one another. The opposing electric charges of atoms, in this case, is carried by the subatomic particles that make up these atoms. So a positive charge is carried by the protons of the nuclei of the atoms, while a negative charge is carried by the electrons of the atom. If the atom is predominantly made of electrons, then it will have a negative charge, while if the electron is predominantly made of protons, it will carry out a positive charge. So if there's an equal ratio of electrons to protons, then the charge will be neutral. But again, I think this all underscores the point of there being a unity of opposites within nature, which we're seeing manifest on the molecular scale in nature. So I think that Heraclitus's basic metaphysical principle of the unity of opposites and this notion of metaphysical war, which which is sort of expressed in that principle, is particularly an empirically, tenable concept. Insofar as we see this unity of opposites being played out on the molecular level, and I think we could also see it played out in other scales of nature. Given our time constraints, we can't really go into all the scientific domains which this principle might be empirically demonstrated. But I think starting off at the molecular micro scale is a good place to start, because we can see kind of at the basic, most fundamental level, we see this warlike process happening. So anyways, that's my 2 cents. I'm curious as to what reflections you have regarding metaphysical war, Ryan.
Yeah, I mean, I think that war is, in some sense, a fundamental metaphysical principle or reality. However, whether or not war is a fundamental principle of reality in and of itself, I'm not too sure. In this sense, perhaps war as a metaphysical principle is fundamental insofar as it pertains to like our reality qua human being.
Right.
But perhaps it manifests itself as sort of like a fundamental metaphysical principle, as a result of it being like a category of understanding, as Kant would maybe put it.
Right.
So maybe understanding things in terms of war as opposites or competing drives, might be an artifact of the human mind.
Right.
And we just may have no other choice but to understand reality and nature in those terms, like polarities and opposites. So,
right.
I'm not sure it makes a difference, but
right.
It may just be an artifact of our understanding.
Right. No, I think that's a profound observation. I think it there's truth to that. I think that in thinking about metaphysics and the structure of reality, there's reality, and then there's what we bring to our experience of reality with our own perceptual apparatus and equipment. And of course, that's going to impact the way we perceive reality and how we conceive reality. And as you pointed out, maybe war, this concept of war, is part of that built-in perceptual apparatus. Insofar as perhaps a priori, we come to perceive the world in that way, as this unity of opposites.
It might be a result of our self-awareness. For example, it might be because human beings are self-conscious, as beings in the world, that we get this sense of us versus the world, or nature versus us, nurture.
Right. Yeah.
We feel this a lion or an animal, for example, may have no distinction between self or other.
Mm-hmm.
It's just sort of acting on instinct, and has a very different existence.
Mm-hmm.
So
mm-hmm.
Who knows?
Yes. Yeah. Perhaps this tendency, as you pointed out, to think about the world and conceive of the world in these opposing polarities. Perhaps it's just an artifact of the human mind. And given different brains and different bodies and different minds, we might perceive the world in radically different ways, maybe more simplistic ways, more instinctive ways. That is kind of more void of these conceptual distinctions that we're making. And perhaps those vestiges still exist within us, this more instinctive part of knowing the world. But we also have this more evolved part as well. Maybe it comes about through the result of the development of our cerebral cortex and so on, that allows us to conceptualize things more abstractly. But in any case, that's opening up a whole other can of worms, which, it's a rabbit hole that maybe avoid diving down in for this discussion. But in any case, no, I think those are good observations, Ryan. And I think a lot of what you're saying anticipates our next topic of our discussion. So perhaps this is a good segue to talk about the psychological nature of war, our second thesis. And we could summarize the second thesis thusly. War is psychological. It pertains to the mind and behavior, and it manifests itself in the archetype of the warrior, in the warrior's patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving. So in this section, I want to briefly touch upon archetypal psychology and also what Friedrich Nietzsche had to say about war, which relates to that notion. And just to preface this discussion, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about here draws inspiration from the psychological writings of Carl Jung and his notion of archetype, and also the neo-Jungians, Moore and Gillette, who co-authored a book called King, Warrior, Magician, and Lover, in which they discussed the archetypes of the mature masculine psyche, and the warrior archetype was among one of those archetypes discussed. So a lot of my thinking is informed by both of those influences. So to delve into the discussion here, if metaphysical war represents the nature of war in the most general and global sense, psychological war represents the nature of war in a more particular and personal sense. War in the psychological sense characterizes the nature of human psychology when understood as an archetype of the psyche, especially as it is manifested in the warrior archetype of the male psyche. And I guess the pertinent question to ask is, what is an archetype, for those who haven't encountered archetypal Jungian psychology before? Well, an archetype is a deep structure of the human psyche. It's a structure that's equivalent to a blueprint that structures our characteristic ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving. Archetypes are related directly to the instincts of animals, including ourselves. And they may be thought of as primordial images of the prototypical models of human beings. And artists and poets and religious prophets have always talked about such archetypes, and they have a deep affinity with these archetypes. And archetypes, moreover, are latent and they are agent within us. And they represent the ideal patterns and potentials that can be actualized within us. And finally, archetypes are universal. So with that definition in mind, let's talk about the characteristics of, well, first of all, before I get into the characteristics of the warrior archetype, Ryan, does this definition make sense to you? Do you have anything else you'd like to modify or add? Or
No, I think you got it pretty good.
Okay, good.
Yeah, you got that.
Hit the hammer with the
the only
nail.
thing I might note is that there might be, if people are familiar with archetypes, there might be some, overlap between this archetype and perhaps like your general hero archetype. Maybe something of interest if you want to look more into it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, maybe these are just different labels for talking about the same archetype, or subtle variations of a family of resemblance of archetypes. But in any case, we'll get clearer on exactly what the warrior archetype in this sense means. So let's talk about the warrior archetype in his fullness. And to gain a clearer sense of the essential characteristics of the warrior archetype and how this archetype embodies war, we will briefly turn to an authoritative account of war and of warriors provided by philosophical adorer of war and warriors, Friedrich Nietzsche, in several passages from his representative works, including Thus Spoke Zarathustra and Twilight of Idols. And these essential characteristics of the warrior include transpersonal commitment, aggressiveness, and courage. So we'll discuss each of these in turn. So to begin, Nietzsche touches upon the tendency of the warrior to dedicate himself to a transpersonal commitment. That is, to dedicate himself to something greater than himself. And in this regard, the warrior may serve a cause, God, people, task, or nation. Lancelot, for example, serves as an ideal for chivalry, and as well as God. Rather, he serves the ideal of chivalry as well as God. For Nietzsche, the warrior also serves a more philosophical ideal. So Nietzsche makes this clear in the following passage when he states, quote, "If you cannot be saints of knowledge, at least be its warriors. They are the companions and forerunners of such sainthood," unquote. So on my interpretation, for Nietzsche, the warrior is devoted to the cause of waging war for victory and knowledge. And the ultimate cause for the warrior is the conquest of knowledge, a cause that has primacy over other causes, such as the pursuit of peace. And for Nietzsche, though he felt that peace was a transpersonal cause worthy of devotion, I think it's evident from my reading of Nietzsche that he thought it was subordinate to the devotion of victory and knowledge. So in this regard, he writes, quote, "You should love peace as a means to new wars, and the short peace more than the long. To you I do not recommend work but struggle. To you I do not recommend peace but victory," unquote. It's from Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So that was the previous quote as well. I don't know if I mentioned the source. But in any case, what Nietzsche is suggesting in this passage is that the striving for peace is subordinate to and a means to the even greater cause of waging new wars for the achievement of victory in those wars. To be perpetually oriented towards achieving victory in war is the way of the warrior, as peace perpetually waxes, wanes, and subsides, and gives way to new wars in an eternally recurring cycle. So, therefore, the Tao or the way of the warrior, whether the warrior be a samurai or a philosopher or a religious saint, that's the nature of war and warriors. So, note too that in this context, in the context of this passage, the victory that Nietzsche has in mind here is a victory in knowledge. So, what this victory in knowledge, what this is exactly? Well, it's a broad question. It could be, a victory of scientific truth over pseudoscientific falsehoods. It could be the victory of spiritual and ethical truth over religious and unethical opinions. And the transpersonal cause of the warrior, it's not merely a philosophical pursuit of knowledge, but insofar as we understand knowledge as it's not strictly a pursuit of metaphysical knowledge, in philosophical sense, but it's also a pursuit of spiritual and ethical knowledge. And the warrior's cause, in a complementary sense, then can also be spiritual and ethical. So you think of examples like Christ and Christ's pursuit, to teach humanity the value of love, or Buddha's pursuit to teach humanity the value of enlightenment. These would also be cases in point as well, of spiritual warriors. And Nietzsche himself would also seem to espouse this view when he writes, quote, "The most spiritual human beings, if we assume that they are the most courageous, also experience by far the most painful tragedies. But just for that reason, they honor life because it pits its greatest opposition against them," unquote. And that's from Twilight of Idols. So think again of Christ. Christ was perhaps amongst the most courageous in that he was dedicated to teaching humanity spiritual truths in the face of harsh criticism and punishment, which eventually led to the tragedy of his crucifixion and of his death. So that's the first aspect of the warrior, is transpersonal commitment, and some of the relevant meanings of that concept and how it is embodied by the warrior. I'm curious, Ryan, what your take is on the transpersonal commitment of the warrior. Does my accounting of this notion make sense? Do you think it's fairly comprehensive? Does it leave out anything?
No, I think it's great. I think that transpersonal commitment is probably one of the most important things, central to the warrior archetype. They have something, some principle or something that they're fighting for that kind of supersedes everything else, including, their own life. They're willing to sacrifice themselves for truth or for knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
So, uh, in the first quote there that you had there, about saints of knowledge, warriors of knowledge. I think Nietzsche himself, or Nietzsche's kind of talking about himself in a way, and he kind of serves as that archetype for that warrior of knowledge. He left the halls of academia and gave up sort of his sainthood, in the universities, instead to become kind of this warrior of knowledge, someone who fights for and defends it against dogmatic falsehoods, as well as other errors of conscience. And I think in a way the saint can be seen as someone who is someone of a conservative, someone who tends to care for and preserve knowledge and tries to sustain peace rather than moving towards victory. Right? They're sort of conservatives in that sense,
Right.
as opposed to Nietzsche, who's more of a radical.
Right.
So yeah, that's something to note there. And down at your third quote, about the most spiritual human beings, brought to mind Viktor Frankl and the will to meaning. And when people are faced with these tragedies, oftentimes it gives insight into sort of like a existential knowledge of what it means to be human. And I think that's large in part what Nietzsche is talking about, is victory and knowledge about humanity and how to kind of push it forward.
Right. Right. Yes. I mean, I like everything you pointed out there. The nuances of that distinction between the saints of knowledge and its warriors too. I think that's something I hadn't given detailed consideration as you have there. So it kind of clarifies the distinction between the two for me. I think that also that Viktor Frankl is a good case in point for the type of warrior archetype we're considering here, especially in sort of the philosophical, spiritual, the ethical aspects, and I think that I think a lot of too what Nietzsche is talking about here, though he's talking about victory and knowledge sort of as this transpersonal goal of the warrior. I think even more broadly, if we were to put his notion of the warrior in a broader context, I think what animates the warrior in sort of maybe the broadest metaphysical sense is his drive towards self-transcendence or self-overcoming. And so I think that this tendency to strive to achieve victory in knowledge, to discover new truths, to uphold them, to disseminate them among humanity, is nested in this maybe broader psychological tendency to self-overcome or self-transcend, insofar as the warrior is perpetually trying to fully actualize himself and going beyond that, overcoming his limitations, and then, ultimately transcending, devoting himself to something beyond himself, towards the ideal, towards towards realizing the ideal within himself and within the world. So I thought I would point that out as well, because put in the context of the broader discussion in which Nietzsche discusses the warrior. That's sort of the the fundamental transpersonal goal is this striving towards self transcendence or self overcoming as well, I think. So that's the warrior and his dedication to a transpersonal goal. That's among the most salient aspects of the warrior. And maybe so the warrior has this transpersonal commitment. And how exactly does he realize this commitment, this commitment to a transpersonal goal? Well, he strives to achieve his transpersonal goal through another one of his tendencies, which is that of destructiveness. So this is to say the warrior destroys what needs to be destroyed, such as the destruction of corruption, tyranny, oppression, injustice, obsolete and despotic forms of government. So consider, for example, the soldiers who fought for the Allies in the Second World War. They fought to end fascism and injustice wrought by the Nazi army and other despotic forces through acts of destruction through military force, for instance. The warrior's destruction, moreover, when properly controlled and exercised with discernment, is creative destruction. So in destroying, the warrior creates new civilizations, new artistic and spiritual ventures for humankind. So take, for instance, the hunter. The hunter exercises discernment in that he knows that he knows what he wants. He wants to hunt prey, say, an elk, and he knows how to get it, through the skilled use of his bow and his arrow, through tracking his prey, through patiently waiting for the opportune moment to kill the prey with the release of his bow. And what the hunter reaps from destroying another animal, say an elk, is the bounty of the hunt, and which is food and nourishment for himself and for others whom he serves. So that's him realizing a transpersonal goal through his creative destruction, the killing of another animal for the sustaining of another animal. So that's transpersonal commitment. Another aspect of the warrior archetype is his aggressiveness. So Nietzsche underscores this important trait of the warrior, his aggressiveness, in the following quote. So he states, quote, "You should have eyes that always seek an enemy, your enemy," unquote. And that's from Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Now, I think what this observation of Nietzsche is pointing to is the habitual tendency of the warrior to seek an enemy. And I think this speaks to his aggressiveness, the warrior's aggressiveness. And aggressiveness might be thought of as a condition of being roused or energized and motivated toward a transpersonal goal, such as the vanquishing of one's enemy in the case of Nietzsche. It can also be thought of as a tendency that's offensive, that's never defensive, and that therefore impels the warrior to push past a defensive and a holding position in the face of life's challenges. So a textbook example that comes to mind is the samurai. I think he exemplifies the offensive tendency. So the samurai always leaps into battle with the full potential of his chi, or his vital energy. And he uses this power and his energy at will. And within the Japanese warrior tradition, of which the samurai is a part, it's claimed that there was only one position to face in battle, which is a frontal position. And this tradition also claimed that there was only one direction to go in battle, which was forward. So this front-facing, forward-moving nature of the warrior is, however, not a brash, unchecked tendency, but it's always checked by self-control. And this pertains to psychological control as well as physical control. So the exercise of this controlled aggressiveness, moreover, is executed with a decisiveness, with an unhesitating confrontation with the situation. And the decisive urgency of the warrior is energized by his awareness of the imminence of his own death. Indeed, what matters to the warrior is not long life, but the courage to face one's imminent death. For therein lies the spirit that animates great actions. Perhaps this is the view that Nietzsche himself would espouse as he mockingly questions, quote, "What matters long life? What warrior wants to be spared?" So that's aggressiveness as another core characteristic of the warrior archetype. Curious to hear from you, Ryan. What do you think of this particular characteristic? And my take on it. I'm all ears to hear what insights you have.
Yeah, I mean, the samurai, I think, is that classic example of aggressiveness, that sort of do not retreat, always move forward kind of mentality. So I commend you on that example. I think most of my thoughts towards aggressiveness also relate to courage. I think mostly what I'm interested in is sort of where these characteristics come from, and is it something that people are simply born with, or is it something that we can train and nurture in individuals, or is it something that's sort of situational? Circumstances arise and it creates warriors, people who would otherwise be sitting on the couch. So anyways, yeah, that's just sort of foreshadowing my thoughts on that. Because I think today it's kind of hard to come up with archetype like examples of a warrior, in our modern day. That's also sort of foreshadowing some other things I have to say. But in any case, right. I think we could just move on to courage, and I'll kind of elaborate more.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. Yeah, something I'm curious about too is this question of origins. Where does aggressiveness come from? Is it a question of nature, nurture? Is it situational? Is it something that a certain environment or context we find ourselves in? Is it something that the situation itself evokes? That I think raises some interesting questions as to origins there. But yeah, without further digressing too much, and to get back to that main thread, let's get into courage, and which is the next characteristic of the warrior that I'd like to talk about. And so Nietzsche finally points out this other essential characteristic of the warrior, his courage. And he writes, quote, "War and courage have accomplished more great things than love thy neighbor. Not your pity, but your courage has so far saved the unfortunate," unquote. And that's from Thus Spoke Zarathustra again. So according to my interpretation, I think here Nietzsche is claiming that courage is more fundamental to the achievement of greatness than is love. And I think he's not saying that love is of no value in the conduct of life, but I think that he's saying that love needs to be accompanied by courage. Perhaps it's the best way to love your enemies, in fact, because I think courage itself is this drive to approach something that you fear, while love gives you feelings of affections and concern over that thing that you fear. So I think that line of thinking, something that Nietzsche himself would endorse, as is evident from another quote of his, which is to quote, "Let there be courage in your love. With your love, you should proceed toward him who arouses fear in you." And, think of the example of the hostage negotiator. So, the hostage negotiator requires, a certain amount of courage to handle his situation, and to require he needs courage to overcome the fear he has of confronting, say the terrorist who he's trying to negotiate with, right? Suppose the terrorist is taking hostages. Well, he requires courage to approach to begin with, this potentially hostile and dangerous person. But he also, by the same token, requires a certain amount of love, if love is the right term there. Insofar as the hostage negotiator, in some sense, he has to show some concern over the terrorist's needs, over the terrorist's demands in that situation. Or consider, for example, the diplomat seeking to negotiate the end of a violent war with another nation. So the diplomat will need to have courage to confront, say, the heads of state or the political powers who have the authority to end the war. But they also need to show a love towards these political powers. He needs to show, the diplomat needs to show a care and concern over, the heads of state and their needs and their interests and their terms and conditions, that are demanded by the situation. So that's sort of courage in the general sense. More specifically, courage, if we understand it as in the way we have, it's this drive to approach. It's also inspired by love, and it's also, moreover, it also has a physical and a moral nature. So let me briefly go into that. So courage, on the one hand, is physical in nature, and physical courage is what enables the soldier to face the dangers posed by enemies on the battlefield, for instance, such as physical pain, hardship, death, or threat of death. And physical courage is what enables him to overcome the fears that these dangers evoke within him, with self-possession, with confidence, and resolution. Moral courage, on the other hand, is the ability to act rightly in the face of popular opposition, or in the face of shame, or in the face of scandal, or discouragement, or personal loss. So I think if we want to think of some examples here, moral courage is what gave Galileo the ability to assert that the Earth revolves around the sun, or gave Darwin the courage to. Moral courage is what gave Darwin the ability to assert that man evolved from simpler organisms, despite the fact that each of these men faced serious opposition from the general public. And in the case of Galileo, he was condemned by the Catholic Church to house arrest. In Darwin's case, he was harshly criticized by both religious authorities and members of the intellectual and the scientific establishment for his unorthodox ideas proposed in his theory of evolution by natural selection. So I believe it's the latter kind of courage that Nietzsche has in mind when he argues that one ought to be a warrior of knowledge, to be someone who has the moral courage to seek knowledge and to communicate knowledge for the betterment of humanity, despite the adversity that one may face in spite of this. So that's the last of the qualities of the archetypal warrior that I wanted to touch upon. Does my summary here, Ryan, again, do you think this captures sort of the essence of courage, or the nature of courage as it pertains to the warrior? Just curious about your thoughts in general.
Yeah, I like that you pointed out that sort of moral courage is the focus, I think, for what Nietzsche is talking about when we're talking about warrior of knowledge. Great examples: Galileo, Darwin. Sure, there's many more that anyone listening could name. And I think that's sort of, like I said earlier, the archetype that Nietzsche was trying to embody with his philosophy, trying to move away from the sainthood and towards the warrior, presenting truths that are perhaps uncomfortable and which conflict with sort of the establishment view that you were saying there. Also, to where this courage to engage in acts of aggression, I think a lot of that we're in some sense born with. In some sense, we're also our capacity for courage and aggression is nurtured or grown either through encountering traumatic experiences and overcoming them, or training as an actual warrior in some sense, whether that's philosophically or physically as a soldier. But I think ultimately where a warrior of knowledge will get their courage to engage in sort of these dangerous acts of aggression is from that transpersonal sort of goal or commitment that they have.
Mm-hmm.
It's that attachment, it's that commitment to that transpersonal goal that allows them to put their lives on the line, essentially, or their reputation.
Right. No, I think that's a good observation. I think that perhaps you've hit the nail with a hammer there. I think that when you look back at what animates warriors is, the transpersonal causes that they're fighting for, and we'll touch upon this a bit later on when we talk about war in the military sense, and the warrior, arguably, one of his core transpersonal commitments is this commitment to justice, and I think that what makes the world a just place to live in is those who defend justice, often through bloodshed, and I think that's a powerful motivator. I think it's going beyond, egotistical desires and wants. I don't think the warrior is animated by such things. If he is, then he's not a warrior. He's a counterfeit warrior. And, I think that, I think we want to think of it in Nietzschean terms. It's this drive towards self-overcoming, self-transcendence, through upholding this ideal of justice, making a world a better place for all, right? And being able to put sort of your egotistical wants and desires on the wayside, So yeah, I think those a good, powerful motivator indeed. I think it gets to that problem that you were mulling over, this question of where does the warrior's courage come from? And I think that's a powerful motivator, and I think it also speaks to the power of mind, the power of how our ideals shape our reality, so that, I don't want to get too far into like the discussion of mental causation and so on, because that's opening up a whole other can of worms. But I think that's interesting. Maybe it's something we can flag for future discussion. But in any case, I don't want to digress too much. Let's get back to the main thread here. And this is basically the time where I just wanted to, take stock and maybe reflect on the nature of psychological war as we've characterized it. Maybe ask some interesting philosophical questions like, is war a psychological process involved in the way we think and feel and behave? Is Nietzsche correct in his views about war and warriors? Are they accurate or true insights about human psychology? What are the limitations or criticisms of this Nietzschean and this Jungian view of the war and warriors? Are there limitations to the warrior archetype? And how does the warrior embody these unity of opposites that we've been talking about? These unity of opposites that are characteristic of metaphysical war. How do they manifest themselves in psychological war? So first, I'll just offer my take to begin with. So this is my stance on psychological war as it's manifested in the warrior. So I think that the warrior has limitations. I want to address this question of, does the warrior have limitations? I think he does have limitations. And I think these limitations are his potential for sadism and his potential for masochism as well. when the warrior is at his most vicious. And so sadism, in this sense, is the first of the warrior's shortcomings, and this is basically his proclivity towards inflicting pain and suffering on others. And if we want to conceptualize the warrior kind of in Jungian terms, it's sort of the active pole of the warrior's bipolar shadow. So this proclivity towards sadism, in some sense, stems from the warrior's detachment, which can cause the problems for the warrior, both personal and impersonal. And by detachment here, I just mean that the warrior is prone to being, acting unemotionally, say without sympathy or concern for others. And I think that this can be destructive to a man who is caught up in the vices of the warrior's negative side. And the warrior, in his negative aspect, I think, can manifest two kinds of sadism, two kinds of cruelty. So we can call these, on the one hand, passionate cruelty, and on the other hand, on the one hand, we can call this passionless cruelty, and on the other hand, passionate cruelty. So the first of these is this notion of passionless cruelty is, cruelty that's completely void of any strong emotion or feeling. And I think this is aptly illustrated by the Nazi practice of training SS officers. So basically, this involved taking candidates who were SSS candidates for the SS Corps, and what was required of these candidates was to have them raise puppies, to care for the puppies in every regard, to attend to all of their needs, when they were sick, and it would involve feeding them and grooming them and playing with them. And then at an arbitrary moment that was decided upon by the trainer, the candidates were ordered to kill the puppy without any sign of emotion or feeling. And, this training in unfeeling sadism appears to have been effective for the intents and the purposes of the practice, which was to train the men to become unfeeling killing machines capable of manning the death camps and to systematically and callously torture and murder millions of human beings, while at the same time still thinking of themselves as upstanding moral citizens. Another example that comes to mind is Darth Vader in the Star Wars movies. And Vader, he systematically betrays and murders the Jedi and all of the members of the rebellion who oppose his bloody tyranny and the dark empire that he serves. And he does so completely dispassionately, without any affection for human beings. So that's passionless cruelty. On the other hand, there's passionate cruelty. This is another tendency of the sadist, but it's a cruelty accompanied by strong emotion or feeling. So such cruelty is animated by an avenging spirit and is often evoked by situations that lead to fright or anger. Looking back at how this manifests itself in Western mythology, we can look back at the Bible, for example, the Old Testament, and the wrath of God. I think this is a good example. Throughout the Bible, we see that God possesses a vindictive power towards those who are in opposition to his will. And for example, we see this in at the story of Adam and Eve, right? So for their disobedience, God curses Adam and Eve and expels them from the Garden of Eden. Another example, tying this back into Homer again, we have the wrath of Achilles. And the wrath of Achilles, Achilles is the supreme warrior of the Greeks in Homer's Iliad. And, his wrath is the principal theme of the epic in some sense. And it is his emotional vice, this wrath, that defines his tendency towards sadism. And I think the opening lines of the poem make this clear. Quote, "Sing, goddess, the anger of Peleus, son of Achilles, and its devastation, which put pains thousandfold upon the Achaeans," unquote. Achilles' anger is not aimed at and unleashed upon his enemy, the Trojan army, who the Achaeans, that is the Greeks, are pitted against. Rather, it's aimed at his own people. Again, quote, such anger, quote, cost the Achaeans countless losses, hurling down the house of death so many sturdy souls, unquote. So Achilles' anger, along with his stubborn pride, is evoked by his quarrel with Agamemnon, which causes his withdrawal from the battle of the Achaeans, who he's on the side of. And the Achaeans, as a consequence of Achilles' withdrawal, suffer a temporary defeat at the hands of the Trojans and Hector, who sides with the Trojans. And then Patroclus, Achilles' best friend, seeks to intervene and lead a retaliation against the Trojans, but Patroclus is ultimately killed by Hector. And the loss of Patroclus motivates Achilles to return to battle, and it stokes Achilles' anger, which he unleashes upon the Trojans in a mass killing spree. So ultimately, Achilles' anger, though it ultimately leads to the defeat of the Trojans and their greatest warrior, Hector, ultimately causes the avoidable death of many Greek warriors whose deaths could have been avoided had Achilles chosen not to withdraw from battle. So ultimately, the tragic deaths of the Greek warrior, is a free choice. It's a free choice of Achilles, who, he lacks the omniscience and he lacks the judgment because it's clouded by anger. And, this anger, the anger of his pride, it suffuses his passionate cruelty towards, his own brothers in arms, which results in their tragic death, and which defines his sadism. So we learn then that I'll just put it at that. I think those tendencies, are good illustrations of this idea of passionate cruelty. And I think we could think of more examples, but these are some of the foremost examples that I can think of. So let me maybe just briefly touch on this other. Well, first of all, Brian, do you have any thoughts on the sadist?
Yeah, I mean, I think to the warrior's detachment, I think again this alludes to his unwavering commitment to that transpersonal goal. You talked about this earlier about how one sort of goal or good sort of takes precedent over another, and I think sometimes what happens is certain principles of just war perhaps kind of get compromised in service of something that's perceived to be greater in value. So like you can use the example of having a certain level of tolerance for collateral damage to achieve a successful attack on a legitimate target. For example, the atomic bombs in Japan, right?
Right.
So I think sometimes there can be that goal that is just so big, you want to win the war kind of thing, that you can fall into doing some pretty horrible, sadistic things to achieve that goal, which I think we'll discuss a little bit later in sort of the just war tradition.
Right.
I think too, in response to like the passionate cruelty, some real world examples I can give would be like Canadian soldiers' response to the use of poison gas by German soldiers. So after that incident, a lot of times Canadians just simply refused to take German prisoners and would just execute them on the spot. And we were famous for using poison gas in return after that incident. And Germans often called Canadians barbarians compared to their British counterparts on the battlefield. The second example I think we can give would be Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay. Sort of the torture of suspected terrorists. That's a good example of sadism.
Right. Yeah, no, I think those are pretty salient examples you bring up, pretty representative examples. I think that it's interesting you point out how the transpersonal goal can often be a motivator towards sadistic tendencies.
Yeah, it can
Either
kind of
like,
make you detached, right? You know, oh, this is nothing, in comparison to what I'm trying to achieve.
right? Yes, it's almost as if the one can pursue the transpersonal goal with a certain, in a spirit that is malevolent. I think that maybe speaks to the importance of character and of virtue, because I think that ultimately, it's one's character which is going to determine whether the ways in which one pursues the transpersonal goal is either going to be conducive to the good or conducive to evil. And if that person has certain vices in their character, then that can, despite the best of intentions, despite the loftiest of transpersonal goals, their actions may manifest in a manner that's ultimately sadistic. So that's one way of kind of riffing off what you were saying there. Maybe it's an issue of character.
Yeah, it could be a issue of character. Some of it can be, an issue of oversight, an issue of, information as well. So,
Mm-hmm.
who knows? There's a lot of factors at play in any given instance. I think when we talk about these things, we generally talk in general terms. We paint like a situation like Abu Ghraib or Guantanamo, with sort of one brush. But I think it really comes down a lot to the individuals and the psychology at play.
Right. Yeah, I know. I would agree. And I think we've sort of touched upon sort of the core factors that are involved, in the sadist behaviors and so on. But perhaps on the flip side, we can talk about the other opposite pole of the warrior's bipolar shadow, which is on the more passive pole now here, which is the masochistic character of the warrior. And this is the second of the warrior's shortcomings, and it's his proclivity toward causing pain and suffering to himself. And it comes from, I think, at least according to theory, it comes from the warrior's adolescent insecurity and his violent emotionalism and his sense of desperation. And it's also in part a negative reaction toward the more nurturing tendencies of the feminine aspect of his psyche. And I think ultimately the masochist projects his warrior energy onto others, and this causes him to feel powerless. And feeling powerless, he's not able to defend himself psychologically or physically. And as such, he'll let others push him around, and he will push himself around. And all of this will push him beyond the threshold of what he can tolerate. And as a consequence, he'll experience a diminished self-respect, as well as a diminished psychological and physical health. And Moore and Gillette, I think they do well to point out the relationship between the masochistic warrior and the compulsive personality. And this is just the tendency of the masochist to be compulsive. And, we can see it manifested, for example, in the workaholic, who, on the one hand, he exhibits this heightened capacity to endure pain, but he also, and this enables him to be productive. We also see it in, workaholic managers. We see it in ministers, social workers, doctors, lawyers, all of whom, sacrifice their well-being for the sake of others. And I think the warrior in these roles ultimately, he harms himself by, pushing himself beyond his limits. And so, these are limitations to the warrior, as we've characterized him. I think these limitations can be overcome. Speaking of self-overcoming, and I think they're best overcome through, counterbalancing the tendencies of the warrior archetype with perhaps other archetypes of the humans. Sorry, types of the human psyche. For example, archetypes that bring warmth and compassion and generativity to the warrior's being, and thereby allow the warrior to fight in the service of goodness and justice and the creation of a newer and freer order. So that's the masochist. Do you have any thoughts on the masochist, Ryan?
Yeah, I'm not sure what your research showed, but while I was reviewing your notes for the podcast, I couldn't help but think of the connection of masochism to the warrior's potential for something like post-traumatic stress disorder.
Okay.
So pushing yourself beyond the threshold of what you can tolerate, it leads to this diminished feeling of self-respect and not feeling safe physically or psychologically. Like all of this seems sort of a manifestation of post-traumatic stress. And yeah, I think what is cited with people with PTSD is it is sort of this rejection of the more feminine aspects of the psyche, sort of this rejection of being afraid or being scared, or you know what I mean?
Right.
So yeah, I think that's a really interesting connection there. Maybe we could explore that further in another podcast.
Yeah. No, I think those are good observations. I like how you linked the tendency towards masochism to post-traumatic stress disorder. And how that it might perturb the warrior's psyche and perhaps direct his behavior in ways that are counterproductive, that are self-destructive. So I think that's a good thing. Good observation you point out there. I think, was there anything else you wanted to add regarding any of the questions that I posed regarding like the warrior's limitations?
Not really. No, I think we covered it pretty well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Another last question I wanted to touch on before we finish off this section is this question of how the warrior embodies the unity of opposites that we discussed with regards to metaphysical war. So, as far as I've conceptualized it, I think the warrior does embody the unity of opposites in a multitude of ways. So, we see it with regard to his behaviors. The warrior can be both destructive and creative, and these, polar tendencies, are used in the service of achieving a transpersonal goal. The warrior also can, on the one hand, be passive, but he can also be active. As far as personality goes, the warrior seems to have these opposing, bipolar aspects of himself. On the one hand, the warrior can be courageous. On the other hand, the warrior can be afraid. On the one hand, the warrior can be, generative and loving, but he can also be sadistic and masochistic. So, there's this tension within the warrior, and between, behaviors, oppositional characteristics, and these oppositions can, have different consequences depending upon where the warrior, has directing his intention, depending on, what transpersonal goal he's dedicated himself towards, So that's how I conceptualize it. I'm curious to ask how you sort of conceptualize that? Do you see these oppositions existing within the warrior?
Yeah, I mean, I think Jordan Peterson has sort of a take on this. He talks about like how, in order to be a good man, in some way you have to be a dangerous man.
Mm-hmm.
Like that capacity for goodness only comes about with that capacity for aggression and or destruction. It gets at that sort of polarity a bit, and I think that really does exist in the warrior. His goodness comes about as from his capacity for destruction. His
Right.
ability to create and destroy are intimately intertwined with one another.
Right.
So yeah, I think that's the warrior does definitely embody sort of that unity of opposites. And, yeah, a metaphysical in a
Yeah.
very real way.
Right. Yeah. No, I think I would heartily agree with that, and I would, just to riff off that a little bit, I think that that if the warrior didn't have this potential to be destructive, to be aggressive, he wouldn't be a warrior. He would be, I think, a shadow warrior. I think he'd be somebody who gets walked over, who gets taken advantage of, who gets bullied, who can't stand up for what he, his ideals and, perhaps the loftier ethical ideals we have as a civilization, like, living in a just world and keeping injustice at bay and the enemies of injustice at bay, and I think this is something we'll touch upon in our final section when we consider the political nature of war and its ethical implications. But I think for now, I think we've reached a good ending point for our discussion, and we can pick up the thread where we left off next time we meet. So how does that sound?
Can't wait.
Cool. So having discussed the nature of war and its metaphysical and psychological dimensions, I would finally like to round out the discussion by now turning to the political dimensions of war. And I would like to talk about the third thesis that we introduced at the outset, which is that war is political in nature, insofar as it is a process manifested on the scale of human warfare, involving a unity of opposites, of change and stability, of motion and rest, of destructiveness and generativity, of injustice and justice, and of a disordered chaos and of an ordered cosmos. And just a side note here, I acknowledge that there are other kinds of warfare, biological, chemical, and cyber warfare, but for our purposes, we will limit the discussion to conventional warfare. So to begin, let us examine the first of these features, that war is a conflict and a unity between the opposing forces of change and motion, as they are manifested in the hostile contention between the armed forces of warring nations. The change and motion we see in conventional military warfare is grounded in the perpetual flux that constitutes the fundamental structure of reality, as Heraclitus held, and manifests itself as a perpetual social flux, one aptly characterized as a state of war. War initiates change by means of motion, by means of the perpetual activity between rival armies, including acts of violence, such as killing, destruction, such as bombing, through the use of military force, that is, through guns and nuclear bombs, for example, until that motion is brought to cessation. Typically, this motion is brought to cessation when a warring nation, or nations, achieves victory over another warring nation, or nations. Acts of violence, destruction, and injustice are brought to an end. The stability and rest of a peaceful and just order is established. So, that make sense, Ryan, at the outset?
Yeah, I mean, what comes to mind here for me is sort of the revolutionary aspects that often coincide with or occur adjacent to war.
Mhm.
So, like, the change in motion that's involved in the social and political ideologies that are at play,
Mhm.
and how that often leads to wars. Sometimes it's wars within a country, like a civil war, or wars between countries, between ideologies of other countries. So you can kind of see how, to relink there, the philosophy and the war.
Right. Yeah, the philosophy precipitates the action. And I could also see that it being the other way around too. The actions also can precipitate the philosophies too. There's that interplay again between thinking and acting. And maybe we can touch upon that in some more depth as we move along here. To return to this notion we've been talking about, political war, I'd like to specifically talk about how the process of war establishes a peaceful and just order by considering the philosophical lineage of this idea, beginning with a revisitation of Heraclitus. As mentioned, political war is a process of perpetual flux that transitions from a destructive and disordered chaos to a generative and ordered cosmos. This is implied in Heraclitus' famous aphorism, where he writes that, quote, "War is both king of all and father of all, and it has revealed some as gods, others as men. Some it has made slaves, others free." Unquote. So to paraphrase this quote and also to amend it slightly, I can say that war can manifest itself as gods, such as Ajax or Athena, or as in men, such as warriors like Achilles or Odysseus, and it renders some as slaves, who we can say are perhaps the losers of the war, and it renders others as free, who we might say are the victors in the war. So what does this mean more deeply? Well, I think that this aphorism offers us a personification of war. War here is personified as a king and as a father. And both the king and the father, especially if we're thinking in Jungian terms and in terms of archetypal psychology, they symbolize a generative and an ordering principle. So my suggestion, at least on this interpretation, is that war, by means of the changes that it brings about, is capable of generating a newer world, a better world, a more just world, as well as a more orderly world, a world void of the chaos, the disorder, injustice, and a world abundant in peace, stability, and justice. So that's my reading of Heraclitus. And to continue now in a little more depth, all of this, I think, preceding discussion raises the question, how does peace emerge from war? And in keeping with Heraclitus' reasoning, we might say that peace comes into being as a consequence of the unity of opposites. So in this case, peace comes into being with the emergence of justice, and that justice emerges from fatal necessity out of its opposite, the strife of injustice. Heraclitus expresses this generation through opposition thusly in the following fragment, quote, "But one must know that war is the same for all, and that justice is strife, and that all things according to strife, and that all things happen according to strife and necessity," unquote. So what Heraclitus is suggesting on my interpretation, in other words, is that justice and injustice can coexist interdependently without becoming denatured. And as such, the justice of peace can only come into being in its dependent interrelationship to the strife of injustice. So that's a little bit of exposition just to orient the discussion reflecting on sort of the lineage of this idea, Ryan. How is this resonating with you at this point? Is this all making sense? Do you have any things you want to clarify, or any additions that you'd like to add to the discussion so far?
Yeah, I mean, at first glance, there's part of me which kind of resists sort of this answer that peace sort of always emerges as a sort of like a unity between opposites. Because like sometimes two sides just agree to disagree, but also kind of stop fighting each other for the time being. Like, look at North and South Korea, for example.
Right.
I mean, technically they're at war, but there's peacetime.
Right.
So it's like sometimes you can have peace without sort of this sort of unity of opposites happening per se.
Right.
But I think what he's saying at the core of it is true about that relationship between strife and justice.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's kind of got that correct.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that I would agree. I think that the example of North Korea versus South Korea is an interesting one, because according to a definition, we might say they're both in a state of peace, insofar as they're not actively warring with each other, but in another sense, they are warring with each other, to the degree that there's still opposition between those two countries. So, yeah, I think it raises some interesting questions regarding, the nature of the concepts we've been talking about, and there's always maybe exceptions to the principle, or things are more complex than our philosophy presupposes. So maybe we can revisit this later on. I like to move on and continue with our discussion of the nature of peace in opposition to war. So typically in the context of conventional warfare, we see the beginnings of peace when the opposing parties agree to end hostilities, often formalized as the signing of a peace treaty. So a question that can be raised here is, what is the nature of this peace that ensues? And peace, I think, can be defined negatively and positively, and therefore has diverse meanings. So the negative definition of peace suggests that peace is the opposite to the change and the motion, destructiveness, injustice, and disorderly chaos that are characteristic of political war. Positive peace, on the other hand, can be defined as a state of rest, wholeness, and completion. And rest here could just be understood as the stoppage of the activities of warfare in favor of periods of fruitful inactivity, where relaxation, satiation, sleep, and other restorative human activities become paramount. And another definition that falls under the umbrella of positive peace is that peace is a just and tranquil order. And the lineage of this concept can be traced back at least to St. Augustine, and has developed into a concept that has multiple meanings and interdependent components. And it's a concept that I'd like to flesh out in some detail, as it will inform our discussion that will follow. So peace, according to this conceptualization, has the following meanings and components. To begin, it understands that peace is justice, where justice in this case is a state of equity, fairness, impartiality, lawfulness, and moral rightness. Peace, according to this conceptualization, also can be understood as a tranquil, stable, and permanent order. And peace, in this sense, to paraphrase the Dalai Lama, is a tranquil state that serves as the foundation for a socially stable society and a relatively permanent social order. A state characterized by a deep sense of security that arises from an empathic understanding of other people, a tolerance for their unique perspective, and an unconditional respect for their rights. For the Dalai Lama, moreover, it's equally a psychological state in which a person undergoes a transformation from a disturbed to a more peaceful person. And in addition, this definition of peace suggests that peace is a state of social cohesion and self-actualization. The state of peace is also one of social cohesion in which people are brought together in a harmonious community. In such a state, there is a wholeness in the community where solidarity, mutual respect, and the satisfaction of everyone's needs prevail. It is also a state that promotes the self-actualization of its community members. Its conditions are favorable for the realization of one's true potential as a human being. The presence of peace, understood as a just and tranquil order, finally, is indicated by an absence of violence in a direct and structural sense. In the former sense, there is an absence of physical force intended to hurt or damage or kill somebody. In the latter sense, there is an absence of violence that is connected with racism, sexism, and other forms of oppression, and an abolishment of the practices and institutions that sustain such violence. Rehabilitation of the perpetrators of such violence and the reconciliation of those who were targeted by it is the task of restorative justice. So that is the nature of peace in a nutshell, at least according to the conceptualizations of peace that we've gone over here. And I would just want to ask Ryan, do you have any things you'd like to bring up here? Is this making sense? What do you make of the nature of peace, in contrast to war?
Yeah, I like the description of it being sort of this tranquil state. In my mind, I had something kind of close to that, but it was sort of a state of homeostasis, like in the body. Oftentimes, something happens, you get injured or you get sick, and that sort of, your body responds to it. You get inflammation or fever or whatever, and your body's got to, fight that off and sort of find some sort of new level, baseline, kind of restore that. So, yeah, I think that tranquility, sort of homeostasis kind of concept really hits the nail on the head for me when I think of what peace is or justice. Yeah, I think that's kind of a good concept.
Right. Yeah, I like the analogy. I mean, I think that it's taking sort of a biological concept and then scaling it up to a political level. And, I think that it's a good way of thinking of how the microcosm and the macrocosm are related. And I think that, perhaps the state of homeostasis and equilibrium within our own body, is, partially a reflection of the homeostasis, as it were, among individuals within a political community. It would strike me as, state free from, a lot of the negative things that impact the body, and if you think of violence, for instance, violence on, the more macro political scale is something, that can impact the body, and its absence is something that can restore the body to equilibrium. So I feel like there's a parallel there.
The sort of narrative I was thinking too with this whole political dimension of war was just using the analogy of kind of what happened in after 9/11. There was sort of like this big, shocking event, and what kind of happened after was a bit of a revolution in the way that the West understood, um, Islamic terrorism and all this stuff in the Middle East.
Mhm.
Kind of revolutionized the way that we thought about things and the way that we did things, and
Mhm.
it raises sort of this call to war.
Mhm.
It sort of challenges sort of all of our beliefs, the way we think about ourselves and the way we think about others, that kind of stuff. And
Mhm.
that revolution is sort of what causes an instability, that sort of disruption in the homeostasis that the war is trying to kind of reestablish. And
Mhm.
then when that war is eventually won, you kind of get a new redefined order, hopefully, some new
Mhm.
sort of way that society, you know, mixes together and finds social cohesion and survives. Um,
Mhm.
that was sort of the narrative that I was looking at when I was reading your notes the other
Mhm.
day.
Mhm.
Was thinking of in terms of like 9/11 and like the way that people's views shift, when going to war and sort of what that was meant to achieve, I guess.
Mhm. Mhm.
There's a disruption to our peace and our security, and that's what the whole thing was. We're making America and the world safe or whatever.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it seems like the unrest of war, um, you know, um, provokes people to, take decisive action to, um, uh, you know, reattain that state of rest, that state of equilibrium, that state of freedom from violence and um, disorder and so on. And I think that might get back to this principle of opposites that we've been talking about too. Um, so, yeah, I think these are all good insights. I think that a lot of what we're talking about kind of foreshadows some of the topics that we're going to be going over shortly.
Sorry, I just wanted to bring up one of the fragments that you had that I really liked.
Oh, for sure. Yeah,
Um,
let's revisit that.
yeah, so the one about like war is both king and father of all, and it has revealed some as gods, others as men. Some it has made slaves, others free. Um, to me, that's like a really you know good quote that you chose there, because what I feel like it's saying is like war establishes an order. Like when I think of like a revolution or a war that happened, that does that, I think of like the Bolshevik Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
Where the whole sort of structure of society was flipped on its head. So like, one moment you're a peasant, and um, you have nothing, and then now you're sort of the king of the biggest empire in the world. It's sort of like that. War is what sort of determines your fate in that sense, whether you're a god or a slave.
Right.
And it can make you one or the other in an instant. You can be a god one moment and a slave the next. And I think it sort of like shows it kind of to be like that great equalizer and the ultimate thing. Like it's like that ultimate changer.
Mm-hmm.
It tears someone down, from the highest point, and it can bring someone up from like the lowest.
Right. Yeah, I know. I think that's a good insight you point out. I don't know enough of my Russian history to say much about the Bolshevik Revolution, so I think you could probably educate me a bit more on that. But I kind of grasp the underlying principle, at least. I feel that what you're saying is suggesting that war can kind of upend the balance of power in a society, where you know um, a group of people or even an individual person can go from a place of disempowerment to a place of empowerment and of having power, political power where they didn't before. I can also think perhaps of like the French Revolution, for instance, and the
American
overthrowing
Revolution.
the American Revolution, the throwing of monarchies and despots and so on,
colonialism and all that.
And the replacing of that by a rule of the people, more of something akin to maybe a better, more democratic state of affairs, where power and autonomy are transferred to individuals, conceptualized as having locus of control over their world. And
I think that might be one of Nietzsche's main complaints is it makes slaves kings in a sense, right? It can make the herd lead society or whatever. It can. It's sort of I guess Nietzsche's criticism of the French Revolution, right?
Right.
Anyways.
Yeah. There again, you're going to have to educate me more because I'm not as steeped in Nietzsche as you are, but I kind of get the gist of what you're saying. Perhaps that's material for a future podcast. I'd like to get into that a little more. But yeah, no, I get what you're saying. So I think all of what we're talking about here is anticipating where our conversation is going, which is towards an examination of the ethical dimension of political war. So having examined the relationship of war to peace and having examined the nature of the peace that results from war, I would like to now turn to an examination of another ethical dimension that defines political war, and that we have mentioned, the view that war can be defined as a struggle of justice over injustice. The starting point of thinking about the ethical dimension of war, in keeping with Heraclitus' reasoning regarding the unity of opposites, is that war is necessary for justice. A contemporary ethical theory that seeks to defend the position that war is necessary for justice is known as just war theory, which seeks to provide a moral evaluation of war as a whole and the conduct within war. Just war theory has a long lineage. I think it can be traced back to at least Aquinas, who drew the moral distinction between the moral correctness of war as a whole and the moral correctness of the conduct within war. The former he called jus ad bellum, and the latter he called jus in bello. And those are just Latin terms for capturing the essence of that distinction. In contemporary philosophy, just war theory continues to be a prominent view for providing the moral justification for war. It has been defended most notably by Michael Walzer in his book Just and Unjust Wars. So let's briefly dig into what just war theory is. So, and let's just examine its central tenets. So recall that just war theory defends the position that war can be just. And to be more precise, just war theory does not make the global claim that all wars can be just. Rather, it claims that some wars can be just, provided that two ethical principles are satisfied, that the war as a whole is just, and that the conduct of the combatants within the war is equally just. So the former principle, as mentioned, is jus ad bellum, and the latter principle, as mentioned, is known as jus ad bello. So let's examine these principles in more detail and to better understand the reasons why some wars are morally permissible within just war theory. So the first of these principles, jus ad bellum, that is the right to go to war, dictates that unfriendly acts and circumstances justify a proper authority in declaring war on another nation. There are a host of criteria for the declaration of a just war, but I will limit myself to two that are salient to the discussion: the principle of right intention and the principle of last resort or necessity. So the first of these principles states that the just belligerent must have rightful intentions, namely to fulfill a just cause, such as to advance good and curtail evil. And just as a side note, I think this point harks back to our discussion on warriors. The warrior, again, is dedicated to this transpersonal goal, in this case, the curtailing of injustice and the restoring of justice. But I digress, so let me return to the main thread. And let's consider the intentions of the Allied forces in declaring war on Germany as an example here in World War II. So in the first case, the allied forces, whom we can consider the just belligerent in this example, could have argued that they had rightful intentions because they sought to advance the good, namely the advancement of peace among the nations involved in the war, and they sought to curtail evil, namely to curtail the moral wrongdoing they perceived as being perpetuated by the Axis forces. For instance, one could argue that the Allies intended to achieve the peaceful purposes of bringing a cessation to the violence and establish harmonious relations among all parties involved in the war, to bring an end to the indiscriminate killing of combatants, to end genocide, to promote social cohesion and solidarity between the Allied forces and the Axis forces. The second of these principles, the principle of last resort or necessity, claims that there is no other way to fulfill the rightful intention of motivating the war except by military means. In other words, in the Heraclitean sense, war is necessary to fulfill the opposite state of affairs, the state of peace. For instance, the advancement of peace and the curtailment of evil for the just belligerent, the Allied forces, involve the use of military inventions deemed necessary to promote the foundation of a tranquil and just political order within those nations affected by the war. No other means, such as nonviolent diplomatic negotiations or nonviolent protests, were viable options for the Allies in their intention to promote peace and to end evil. So, is that all that making sense so far, Ryan? Anything you want to clarify or bring into the discussion at this point?
No, I think just the most straightforward example of a just cause would be, someone invading your borders, for example. Someone, like Russia comes over your borders, you certainly have a just cause to go to war in return, for example. That's sort of the cut and dry case that everyone can use.
Right. Yeah. I think that's a good contemporary example. I think we could formulate, Ukraine's decision to go to war in those terms, as being motivated by a just cause, and so I think that's a good contemporary example. And we might say that it was, of necessity, in the sense of we've been talking about too. So to continue, the second of these principles is in just war theory, as mentioned, is this principle of jus in bello, which we can understand as right conduct in war. And this is basically a set of ethical rules for participants conducting the war. And the rules are twofold. So first, there's the rule of proportionality. And the rule of proportionality regards how much force is necessary and morally appropriate to the ends being sought, and the justice suffered. So again, returning to World War II, the rule of proportionality can be illustrated by, say, considering the Battle of Britain, in which the Royal Air Force of the British military deployed all of its aircraft and its 11 Group to counteract the two massive waves of German attacks on Britain, in which the RAF was able to shoot down 60 German aircraft, which could be argued to be both morally appropriate and necessary, as the RAF were outnumbered by the German Luftwaffe. So it was necessary that they deploy all their aircraft. And it was also necessary, moreover, as such a mass rallying of aircraft was able to repel German forces and postpone the German invasion of Britain and force the German Luftwaffe to switch to nighttime raids, which boded well for British forces as it allowed them to rebuild its military forces. So they might not have been able to have affected that outcome without taking those actions. So they were perhaps necessary in that sense. As to the second of these ethical rules, we have the rule of discrimination. And this rule dictates who are the legitimate targets in war, and specifically makes a separation between combatants who it's permissible to kill and non-combatants who it's not permissible to kill. So, for instance, the strategic targeting of an enemy nation's military industrial production facilities, as the United States Air Force did, and as the Royal Air Force did, are rather than civilian occupied areas. These are cases in point, and failure to follow both of these rules that I've mentioned results in the loss of legitimacy for the just war belligerent. So that is just war theory in a nutshell. And I think all of the preceding discussion of the concepts we've been going over, Ryan, I think that all provides good background for a more open-ended discussion about political war. And so I have some questions that could be posed regarding political war. Some of them kind of we've mentioned indirectly. One question we might raise is, does political war, that is a military war between opposing parties, involve a unity of opposites, of change and stability, of motion and rest, of destructiveness and generativity, of injustice and justice, and of a disordered chaos and an ordered cosmos? It raises the question, is political war generative and conducive to order? Raises the question, does just war theory provide adequate justification for the claim that political war is just? And it also raises questions regarding perhaps not going to war, and which is that, is pacifism a better alternative to war? So I know for my part, I kind of want to narrow my thoughts and my reflections to two salient questions from that group. One being, does just war theory provide an adequate justification for the claim that political war is just? And also, is pacifism a better alternative to war? So how does all of that sound, Ryan, to you?
Sounds great to me.
Okay, sounds good. Before we start getting on this discussion, was there anything else you wanted to, had any questions you had, anything you wanted to add in regarding just war theory and the concepts we talked about?
Yeah, maybe just fleshing out the proportionality thing a bit more. Something you might see, in the news or on the global stage is, a country might strike another country, in the case of, Iran striking Israel, and you might see a response back that's in proportion to what was received. So you're not going to see, Israel necessarily, wholesale start a war and try to invade Iran over, a missile strike. There's some proportionality that needs to be had. So it's like, yes, they might try to strike something back, but that's kind of where it ends for now. It's trying not to escalate things too much. I think that's where the proportionality bit comes in.
Mm-hmm.
Because things can get out of hand pretty quickly, especially with today's modern weapons and tactics and things.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good contemporary example again that you bring up there. And I think this the topic of the the war in Gaza, that could be a whole podcast episode onto itself regarding its ethical implications, and we could examine that war. I think that's a good war to examine within a just war framework, and ask whether it is a just war. But my own sense is that the Israeli army, to a degree, has violated that rule. It seems to be a disproportionate conduct that the Israeli army has taken in many respects. But again, I think that's opening up a whole can of worms, but I think it is a good example that you mentioned. So let's get back to this first question here that I wanted to ask. So does just war theory provide adequate justification for the claim that political war is just? So to better address this question, we need to first consider the concepts jus ad bellum, right in war, and jus in bello, right conduct in war. And recall that jus ad bellum concerns whether the cause for a particular war is just, whereas jus ad bellum concerns whether the just belligerents conducted themselves in accord with the rule of proportionality and discrimination. If we can establish that a war has been waged according to the principles of jus ad bellum, that the war is just, and jus ad bellum, that the just belligerents have conducted themselves according to the rule of proportionality and discrimination, then we may be justified in drawing the conclusion that a particular war can be a just war. But if we cannot establish the war has been waged according to these principles described above, then we may be justified in drawing the conclusion that the particular war cannot be just. To assess whether just war theory can be just in that sense, I'd like to turn to the issue of whether there can be a just cause to justify a war, and to properly assess if we can answer affirmatively or negatively to the question of whether a war can be just according to those principles. Let's consider an example of World War II. And one thing I wanted to ask was, regarding the first aspect of just war theory, the principle of jus ad bellum, right to war, I'd like to ask, was World War II based on a just and righteous cause? And were the intentions right? Did the belligerents, the allies in this case, seek to diminish evil and to promote the good? If the answer to those questions is yes, I think that the allies, the just belligerent, had a genuine right to go to war, and thus the war was just on that ground. So just to play devil's advocate here, let's say I want to say that yes, it was a just war. From the standpoint of the Allies, we could argue that their declaration of war on Germany and other members of the Axis was justified on the basis of being a just cause, as it was meant to counter the injustices inflicted by the German army and other members of the Axis upon the world's population. So first, you could argue that it was just in that it was carried out by the various allies as a national defense, to defend themselves from the Germans and the other powers of the Axis. And that seems to be borne out by historical events. Germany attacked Britain and France and Russia. And so, I feel like that that was motivation and reason to go to war, according to just war principles. And then second, one could argue that it was just in that it was carried out to stop grave humanitarian injustices, that the German army and the Axis were wreaking upon those allied members who were in opposition to them. And this involved, the killing of innocent civilians who were caught up in the war. And so we could argue that, the war was just on the basis of, being motivated by this humanitarian intervention. And then we could also say that it is a just war by considering, the motivations of the Allies were to end certain humanitarian injustices that were brought about by the war. For example, war crimes, and these would be, atrocities against enemy combatants or conventional crimes by military units. And so I think a good example here is the invasion of Poland. So without any declaration of war, the Germans led by Hitler invaded Poland, and they murdered, I think, something like 16,000 people. So I think, there's perhaps necessary to go to war for that reason. And then there's lots of other examples abound that I could bring up here. There was the Normandy massacres. So this was a series of killings in which 156 Canadian prisoners of war were murdered by the 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitler Youth, during the Battle of Normandy. And then we can consider other humanitarian injustices. which are often referred to as humanitarian crimes. I think that that was the word they used in the Nuremberg trials, or crimes against humanity, as it were. So humanitarian crimes are committed well away from the lines of battle, and they're unconnected directly to the ongoing military activity, and they're distinct from war crimes. And so you can think here of the employment of concentration camps, for instance, across Europe by the Nazis, such as Auschwitz, which held prisoners of war and political prisoners in inhuman conditions, and involved the transportation of the Jews and Roma to extermination camps, and where they were then killed inhumanely, and this resulted in the crime of genocide, because it was carried out on such a mass scale, and ultimately, this was what the final solution was meant to accomplish, which was one of Hitler's plans to exterminate the Jews through this act of genocide. So these are some things to consider when considering whether just war theory is true, and when trying to consider the justification for just war theory. So I'm curious, Ryan, do you think that just war theory for you provides an adequate justification for political war, given everything we've considered?
I think it's a good framework, but I think just war theory itself may kind of have built into it the assumption that there are just and unjust wars. As a theory, I think it does a really good job at explaining what makes a just war just versus an unjust war unjust. I think that's sort of where power really sits. And I think it does a really good job, for example, I'm going to use Britain in World War II. They joined as soon as the war started, as soon as Hitler invaded Poland, right? They've seen this before with Germany. They have an alliance with Poland. They're there to defend Poland. They have every right and just reason to go to war. There was no option given to negotiate. The war was just started. And from that point of view, from the point of view of just war theory, I think it provides a good framework for saying why that's a good reason, why that makes allies war just.
Right. Yeah. No. I mean, I would agree. I think in considering the justification for certain wars and certain acts of war and violence, I think that just war theory does an adequate job at explaining that. I think other wars perhaps might not follow the criteria outlined by just war theory. So I think it also offers us a framework for identifying that certain wars aren't unjust, that aren't just. They're not based on a just cause necessarily. And I guess you could see those throughout human history. I think most recently, perhaps the war in Vietnam or the war in Iraq.
Wars over historic land claims as well is one of the things that's noted as to be not a valid reason to go to war. So Germany going to war to reclaim all of the old land that was formerly part of the German Empire. Same with Russia. Putin went on a Tucker Carlson rant about how Ukraine has always been part of Russia and it's only exists because of Russia and blah blah blah, and that's why it needs to be part of Russia and blah blah blah. It's that's not a valid reason, dude.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, according to the principles outlined by just war theory, I don't think we would say it was an adequate reason to go to war. Doesn't seem to be a just cause in that sense. Ultimately, I don't know where I sit with the validity of just war theory, in the sense of it providing a justification for a just war. But I think that, in considering the examples we've considered, I think that it helps to offer some clarification why at least some wars are based on just causes.
I think too, just from the good feeling you get from the framework providing sort of a good fit to these scenarios, it gives you a sense that, like, the fact that the framework seems to work like fairly well in these scenarios, it kind of gives you that sort of intuition that there are such things as just wars. It's like you don't need to necessarily be convinced beforehand. Like, use the framework and it'll show you what a just war looks like and an unjust war looks like. And from that, you can go, oh, there are just wars, there are unjust wars.
Right. Yeah, no, I think it provides kind of a line of demarcation, and considering what wars are just, which are unjust. It gives you an explicit criteria to assess that, which I think is, lends itself to discerning a just from an unjust war, if such a thing exists. But also, I think, our discussion here raises a lot of questions regarding the second aspect of just war theory, which is the principle of just in bello, right? Sorry. Let me rephrase that. So it raises a question regarding whether the actions of those in World War II were, conducted according to ethical rules, and so I want to raise the question: was World War II conducted according to the rule, for instance, of proportionality? That is, was the force used necessary and morally appropriate to the ends being sought, and the injustices suffered? So I think that one could argue that the Allied powers conducted themselves according to the rule of proportionality, insofar as their use of military force, the Air Force, the Navy, the Army, was required in order to counter and overcome the military force of Germany and other members of the Axis, and to bring about a cessation to the injustices being committed. And the amassing of massive military force that constituted the Allied forces of Britain, France, the USA, and Canada was needed, you could argue, to counterbalance the massive unified military force that constituted the Axis forces of Germany, Italy, and Japan. Then again, we can see instances where the Allied forces, the just war belligerents, had violated the rule of proportionality, especially with respect to incidents that involved mass killings. So I can think of, for instance, perhaps the most self-evident example is that of the dropping the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And in that case, one could argue that that force was unnecessary for the ends being sought, given the Japanese military had not inflicted a comparable act of violence on the Allied forces. And the dropping of the A-bomb was far more severe in magnitude than anything the Axis suffered from the Japanese military. And thus it was not appropriate for the justice being sought. And I think in the end, the bombing resulted in the deaths of 70,000 to 126,000 civilians, which seemed neither necessary or morally appropriate to the end of serving justice. So I don't know if any other examples for you come to mind in that regard, Ryan?
No, I think those are the two classic ones. Where do you sit on those issues personally? Do you have any intuitions there? Or?
I mean, I feel like, as I had just stated, I think that they were neither necessary or morally appropriate for serving justice, given how much lives were lost as a result of those bombings, in disproportion to the amount of lives that were lost during other battles that involved the Allied forces and the Japanese. I don't know. Maybe there's additional justifications that could be brought to bear on that question. I'd have to mull that over. I'm sure in retrospect, the Americans who dropped the bomb might have had their own moral justification. I'd be curious to learn about what that was.
I can give you a bit of sort of the general viewpoint of the people that would suggest that it was justified. And the general argument goes that Japan still wasn't surrendering and was refusing to surrender in the war after Germany. And in order to achieve their surrender, what it would essentially involve is the beaching of even more Americans and even more fighting and even more deaths than the actual bomb caused. That was sort of the idea behind it, the reasoning behind it. Let's do this so we don't have to lose any more American lives and even bloodier war.
Right.
I can get on board with that, but I think the problem that the world has with that bombing is that it killed all those innocent civilians. It stopped the war, but what it did is it replaced it with an even greater danger.
Right.
Which is, you know what I mean? In a way, it didn't really solve anything. And I think that's sort of the thing that people get hung up on, is it let Pandora out of the box.
Right.
And now we're in a situation that's even worse than before.
Right.
I think that's the problem that people, at least in the West, have a problem stomaching. I'm sure there's a lot of people in Japan that think, otherwise on the ethical implications of dropping a nuclear bomb on those cities. I'm sure they would think otherwise, but
right.
That's sort of, I would say, the other viewpoint. What the other viewpoint would be.
Right. That makes sense to me as far as you've characterized it. I feel like what you were saying was that it was a necessary evil, perhaps, to drop the atomic bombs because, the disastrous consequences averted, outweighed the disastrous consequences of bombing of those cities. In other words, perhaps they predicted that over the long term that the consequence of dropping the bomb perhaps would maybe save more lives in the long run by ending the war, and that it was therefore justified, and that therefore, despite the loss of civilians in Japan on a mass scale, that cost of bombing was outweighed by the benefits of the lives saved, as it was predicted by those who perpetrated that bombing. So it's almost like a kind of a consequentialist type of justification.
And as far as Dresden goes, from my knowledge, Germany was pretty much already done at that point. So
right.
In a very sort of like controversial way, you could almost say that the Dresden firebombing was sort of more disproportionate or more unnecessary than the bombing on Nagasaki and
Hiroshima.
Yeah, because Germany was clearly on its last blows at that point. There was no denying it. Like, Germany was on fire, not in a way that Japan was.
Right.
So yeah, I would say it would be a very controversial argument, but one could say that the firebombing of Dresden was, in a way, something that violated that principle more.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's a good observation. I mean, just to add to that a bit, you could argue that the devastation of the firebombing on Dresden was greater than anything that could have been justified by military necessity alone, right? And I think you could establish the case that the war was not just for that, or that act of violence within the war was not just for that reason, right? So I think too that the bombings claimed like something like 25 to 35,000 civilians. So some could argue that the targeting of the city wasn't necessary. Too, because they were the city itself wasn't like a military garrison or anything, right? It was on the the military garrison, I think, was on the outskirts of the city. So there wasn't much reason to target the city in and of itself, and moreover, the city was of great cultural significance. I think that among all the cities in Europe, it was considered to be like one of the best examples of like the Baroque architecture and culture and so on, and it was considered by many to be among one of the most beautiful cities in Europe. So the bombing seems to be perhaps unjust for that reason as well. But in any case,
sorry, just one more little point on
Sure.
the Nagasaki bombing. One of the other reasons why it was important for the Americans to end that war quickly was because at that point the Soviets were coming into Korea, which was controlled by Japan at the time. So they're trying to stop the Soviets from kind of coming over and taking in the Korean peninsula. So the longer they waited, the more of that peninsula the Soviets would have taken over as well, which they were greatly concerned about by the end of the war.
Right. So that was a further deterrent for what they anticipated to be, further disastrous consequences that could have come about. Soviet takeover of the Korean peninsula. And then I suppose the Allies perceive that as being a threat overall to peace.
Yeah, well, it would be their only port that isn't frozen all year round.
Right.
It would be a huge asset, and to have them that close to, Japan, they would have, controlled Japan and probably that whole sphere of the world, the whole sort of Pacific.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, there's a lot to consider here in this question of whether the conduct was just. I think we've identified some of the salient examples, and that perhaps either help to support or undermine whether conduct within war can be just. In considering the ethical conduct within war in just war theory, another question we can ask is, was the war conducted according to the rule of discrimination? That is, were there determinate targets in World War II, and such that there was a clear distinction between combatants who it's permissible to kill and non-combatants who it's not permissible to kill? So one could argue mostly yes, but in my opinion, sometimes no. That's to say, typically the Allied forces would only aim to kill combatants, yet the Allies also were guilty of perpetrating war crimes and thus acting in violation of the principle of discrimination. And there's examples within the war that bear this out. So some examples I thought of, there's the HMS Torbay incident, and this occurred in July of 1941, in which the submarine, the HMS Torbay, which was under the command of Anthony Myers, was stationed in the Mediterranean, where it sank several German ships. And on several occasions, once off the coast of Alexandria in Egypt, and the other occasion off the coast of Crete, the crew attacked and killed dozens of shipwrecked German sailors and troops. And none of the shipwrecked survivors were any imminent threat to the Torbay's crew. And Myers, perhaps to his credit, didn't seek to hide his actions, at least. as he reported them in the official logs. But he did receive a strong reprimand from his superiors for those actions, and he basically violated the Hague's Convention of 1907, which essentially bans any killing of shipwreck survivors under any circumstances. So he violated the law there, and one might argue too he violated the principles of ethical conduct within war, and therefore we might conclude that perhaps in some respects, the war was not just in a certain sense. Another example that I thought of was the Boscari massacre, and this was occurred in July of 1943. Basically, it took place at the Boscari airfield in Sicily, and in this incident, 76 German and Italian prisoners of war were shot by American troops of the 180th Regimental Combat Team in the 45th Division during the Allied invasion of Sicily. And these killings occurred on two separate occasions, one in July and one in August of 1943. So we might say that those actions too were not conducted according to ethical rules. I don't know if you have any other examples of your own, Ryan, that kind of might serve as counter arguments to the sort of the broader argument that World War II was just. Do you think incidents such as those, or any others you can think of, perhaps undermine the claim that World War II was just?
I mean, not really. I think those are pretty good examples. I think you can find it sort of everywhere in World War II on both sides, where people are doing things that just simply don't follow the rules, and a lot of the rules that we have today on just war come out of what happened in World War II, for example. So a lot of the rules of conduct are based off of things that just simply weren't in place back then. Right. So yeah, I mean, on all sides you can find this, and I think when you look at both sides, you can kind of call it. Well, no, I'm not going to say that. I'm not going to call it a wash, but
yeah.
In terms of combatant on combatant sort of stuff,
mm-hmm.
I think you can kind of call it a wash between like Germany and the Allies. What the Germans obviously did to civilians in the countries they invaded is unparalleled. But
right, yeah, I mean, although we can reflect back on the war and the course of the war and the actions taken by both sides, we might want to say on the face of it, the actions of the Nazis and the Axis forces were perhaps far removed from anything we might deem to be just, either in terms of just cause or just actions. And we might tend to look back at the Allies as being more just in both of those respects. But then again, too, I think if we were to be honest and look at both sides and the conduct of both sides, I think injustices can be observed on both sides. So I think it'd be hypocrisy to say that the Allies were angels, in every respect. There were killings of Axis forces, in a manner that we wouldn't consider to be ethical, in a manner that wasn't proportionate or discriminating. And so I think that this kind of points to maybe the complex and nuanced nature of when considering the ethical justification for the war. I mean, it would seem maybe in the most general sense, we might argue that it was a just war insofar it was based on a just cause. But when we look down at the finer details of the actions of the combatants on either side, we can identify many instances where their actions weren't conducted according to ethical principles.
Yeah, I
which I
think
think
that's an important distinction you made.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's a subtle distinction, but I think it's a significant one. Um, so
Yeah, I think it fits with the theory too. When we're talking about just war theory and right conduct, the responsibility isn't so much on the nations or the countries conducting the wars. It's more down to the individuals and the units, you know, in the war themselves. So, you know, as just war theory goes traditionally, it says that soldiers aren't typically responsible for whether or not and they're not held responsible for whether or not the war itself was just. But what they're held accountable for is their conduct within that war. So, did they conduct themselves in a just way,
mhm,
even if the war itself was unjust? So, like, you can have an unjust cause to go to war, but still maintain to the principles of discrimination and proportionality.
right.
So, I think that's important to consider when we're talking about whether or not um, the war was just. So, from which perspective are we talking about? So from the perspective of the nation, they may have had a just cause to go to war against, the Axis powers, um, and how that war was conducted by the individuals in that war. Um, we can sort of score that more or less just, on a range, because there's going to
Right.
be things that were conducted really well, things that weren't, and there's going to be
Right.
a range of scenarios within
Mhm,
the totality of the war that we
mhm,
can look at, and we
right.
can kind of look and compare, between countries, or within countries, between wars, and sort of maybe even from an idealistic perspective, in an ideal world, what would have this war look like perfectly?
Right.
So yeah.
No, I think that's a good insight, and I think I think what you're suggesting is that in considering whether a war is just, the locus of moral responsibility is in the individual and in the individual's actions to a large degree, at least if we're considering the uh, ethical acceptability of those who were combatants within the war, who
Yeah.
um, you know um, took actions within the war, and
Well, for
like you
example,
said,
the great example you gave, the HMS Torbay,
yeah,
he was reprimanded when he got back. So it's
yeah,
like that individual's responsible for that action. Um, it's not reflecting upon the country per se.
right,
It's not, it's not, the country's not responsible for that. It's that person there. They've been reprimanded. They've been punished.
right. So yes, the moral culpability sat with Commander Myers in
Correct.
his violation of the principle of discrimination in that case, and perhaps that's just example of many that we could consider. But I think too that it gets to the point you just made, and another interesting part of what you said too was that in considering the um, ethical acceptability of any combatant's actions, we can think of it on this continuum, right, where um, people fall somewhere on this continuum of morally acceptable to not morally acceptable, and everything in between, right? So there can be these um, fuzzy shades of gray, as it were, where maybe even an individual participant within the war, we could say some of their actions were in keeping with the principles of proportionality and discrimination, but perhaps in other instances, in cases they weren't. I think this kind of gets to the perhaps imperfectibility of war, and I think Well, and it anticipates kind of what some of my concluding thoughts are, actually. So maybe this might be a good segue to consider some of those. So I think that, after giving this some long thought and having delved fairly deeply into this, I've concluded that World War II could be argued that to be, relatively just, but not absolutely just. And what do I mean by that? Well, I think it was just to the extent that the just belligerents, the Allied forces, were able to promote the good in the end in establishing a new, tranquil, peaceful, and just political order across the world, and to bring to cessation the evil deeds that were wrought by enemy forces, in this case, the Axis forces. So peace, it seems, prevailed in the negative and the positive sense in the end. In the negative sense, there was an absence of violence or war afterwards. And in the positive sense, there was the establishment of a just and tranquil order in which cooperation, harmonious relations between nations, and the promotion of human flourishing and integration prevailed. But they did so at the expense of violating the just war principles we discussed. Though the cause of the Allies was largely just, their conduct in war was not consistently just. So there are many instances in which the actions of the Allied forces acted in violations of the rules of proportionality and of discrimination that we've mentioned. And therefore, at least I would conclude that the war was, relatively just insofar as it did fulfill the just cause, but it wasn't absolutely just insofar as the means taken to the just cause. The actions of the Allied forces were not always conducted according to the ethical rules that I've mentioned. And I suppose one way of getting around that criticism within just war theory is this notion of emergencies. So this notion of emergency suggests that in rare circumstances, the intentional killing of non-combatants is necessary to avoid an unconscionable threat. But non-combatants can only be killed unintendedly, and even in those cases, only if the harm that the non-combatants, say the civilians, only if the harm that they suffer is necessary and proportionate to the intended goals of the attack. So that's one way of maybe reframing the criticism, that in emergency situations, it's morally permissible to kill non-combatants, to kill civilians, because doing so, though it causes harm, it's necessary and it's proportionate to the intended goals of whatever the particular attack was. So considering like Hiroshima, for example, and the bombing of Hiroshima, we might say that according to this principle here of emergencies, we might say that, well, it was permissible because it was necessary and proportionate to achieving the goal of peace in the long run for reasons we identified earlier in our discussion. Although I think that's still this notion of emergencies, I think, is still a controversial claim, but it's one way that the just war theorists might get around instances of killing innocent civilians. Although in cases where it was intended, like the ones that we've talked about, like the Torbay incident, for instance, that was clearly intended. So I think one would have to be strict and say only in those instances where it was not intended. So anyways, that's sort of where I stand right now with my own take on just war theory, Ryan. I'd be curious to get your take on it, as far as would you consider it a just war in either of the senses we've considered? Or
yeah, I agree with the majority of what you said here in terms of it being a just war, and there obviously being some issues with the way that things were conducted. And I think that's reflected historically in the way that these things were handled with Geneva Conventions, all that kind of stuff. So we've been able to look back and reflect on those things, and getting back to sort of what we're talking about when we talk about peace, we've been able to establish sort of like a new order, a more civilized order in terms of like how to conduct war with the kinds of weapons that we have. Keep in mind, like all this was like extremely new. There's no guided precision bombs. You're just
Right.
dropping like buckets of TNT on.
Right.
So a lot of these atrocities is largely what has motivated, this push for technology towards like precision, guided missiles and all sorts of things. And I
Right.
think, again, it reflects that, we went into a period where there's revolution, there's chaos, there's war, and eventually we've been able to establish sort of like a new order, something that is able to hopefully establish something a little more civilized when it comes to conflict.
Right.
Now, with regards to the right conduct in war, things like discrimination and proportionality, one of the things that I think this theory falls short on is when it's applied to like the aggressor or the Axis powers. So one of the things that Jeff McMahon says, he's sort of a critic of just war theory. And in particular, what he talks about is that combatants that are engaged in an unjust war, he argues, because they're engaged in an unjust war, there is no such thing as discrimination or proportionality. Because if you're in an unjust war, there are no people liable to be attacked. There's no real combatants in that sense.
Right.
And so they're not able to ever really satisfy that second condition of just war theory, which is correct conduct.
Right.
And they're liable to be attacked in every sense of the word, simply by being engaged in this unjust war. So
Right.
there's sort of maybe like a criticism, but I wouldn't say that it really plays into a reflection on the ethical implications of what the allies have done,
Right.
their role.
Right.
I just kind of wanted to earmark that for maybe a shortcoming in the theory.
Right.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
other than that, I think pretty much sums up my thoughts.
Right. I think that's an interesting critique you brought up. I think that what the critique is saying is something like, basically the principle that the war is based on a just cause is kind of more fundamental than this question of whether the actions within a war are conducted ethically, and that sort of the ethical permissibility or acceptability of, say, the combatants within a war is only ethical to the extent that the war itself is based on a just cause. So it seems
what
like
would make someone a combatant or liable to attack is that you have a just reason to attack them in the first place.
right.
So like to satisfy that discrimination part, like there has to be a reason to attack them in the first place, right? So it does make sense that he brings that point up.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's an interesting criticism. I mean, I think that
sorry, in terms of that Torbay example, one could argue that because the Axis powers were engaged in an unjust war, that the captain there simply had no obligation to abide by that principle of proportionality, right?
right.
It's one could argue that because they're engaged in an unjust war, they shouldn't be there in the first place. They don't have a right to it's like, oh, you're shipwrecked, who cares? You're not
Right.
supposed to be here in the first place.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you could, to play devil's advocate, you could say something like, the shipwrecked Germans, were illegally encroaching upon, someone else's territory, and therefore that was unjust, and that therefore the indiscriminate killing of those shipwrecked German um, combatants was justified, and if we want to kind of um, perhaps be as charitable as possible in thinking about this specific example. I'm not saying that the commander's actions against the Germans and the killing of those Germans was by any means ethically justified, but you could, if you were to play devil's advocate, perhaps come up with a pseudo justification for his actions, maybe. But in any case, yeah, I like your take on just war theory. I think we have largely agree in many respects. I think it's definitely an issue. It's definitely a theory that I think I need to give more thought to and reflect over to see whether or not I ultimately agree with it. But I think we've identified some of its virtues at least. So I guess to bring up this last question I wanted to talk about, this question of pacifism. And the question is pacifism a better alternative to war? So I myself would argue that if war can be avoided, then pacifism is the better option. And to be more specific, in contexts where war is avoidable, I would advocate an absolute pacifism. And absolute pacifism is just the view that there are no exceptions to the rejection of war and violence. So looking back at history, we can see historical figures such as Gandhi and Martin Luther King. And I think both of those figures showed how absolute pacifism can be successful in opposing war, militarism, and violence without doing any harm to the parties opposed. So in the case of Gandhi, he was a champion of nonviolence, and he showed that nonviolence could be effective in his campaign for independence of India from British colonial rule through leading dozens of nonviolent campaigns. And such efforts had a significant impact on India achieving independence in 1947. And they also inspired movements, the civil rights movements, and across the world. So, Martin Luther King, again, is like a case in point here. He was a Baptist minister, and perhaps following the example of Gandhi, he led a civil rights movement in the U.S., employing Gandhian nonviolent resistance to repeal laws enforcing racial segregation and to work for integration of schools, businesses, and government. And historical figures such as these, I think, show that absolute pacifism could be instrumental in achieving political and moral reforms without any bloodshed through acts of violence. But I can also sympathize with the view that some wars could be justified on the basis of just war principles. And I think I'm sort of I think like a view that's sympathetic to just war principles is not necessarily incompatible with pacifism or some versions of pacifism. So there's one version of pacifism known as contingent pacifism, which holds that certain wars can be rejected on the basis of principle. For instance, if they're not based on rightful intentions, or if they're not necessary, and if they're not conducted according to ethical principles. And so contingent pacifism holds that certain wars, therefore, can be morally permissible if they are indeed based on rightful intentions, if they're necessary, if they're conducted according to ethical principles. And in these cases, I think I might accept the legitimacy of an authority who's fighting, the just belligerent, and affirm that the war is being fought for a just cause. And contingent pacifism, moreover, it also has a following among some of the eminent philosophers and scientists of the past. So Bertrand Russell was one who argued that World War II was justified on the basis of rightful intention and of necessity. And the intention was rightful, he thought, because the end sought was to curtail the worst of possible evils. And it was also necessary, as he thought that Hitler and the Nazis could only be defeated by military means. And then Einstein echoed Russell's endorsement of a just war in the context of World War II as well. And he claimed that it was also necessary. And he wrote, quote, "I loathe all armies and any kind of violence, yet I'm firmly convinced that at present these hateful weapons offer the only effective protection." So that's more of a nuanced view with regards to pacifism and whether it's ever justified to go to war, or is nonviolence the better option. I think contingent pacifism maybe finds the middle ground to say, in circumstances where the war and the violence inflicted by the war is not based on a just cause and is not based on just conduct, then an absolute pessimism, which should be the view that we should endorse, which involves a rejection of all acts of violence, but under special circumstances in which the cause for the war is perceived to be just and the actions of those involved in the war are perceived to be just, then in such cases we can take the middle ground maybe and say more of a contingent pacifism is the better moral option to take in that situation. So that's my view on pacifism and on this question of whether it's a better option than going to war. I think perhaps maybe a middle ground is the position that I would take, or at least that's where I currently stand. Although it's not my final. I don't think it's my final say on the matter. So, where do you stand on this, Ryan? What's your view of pacifism, and you think it's a better alternative to war? Or?
I mean, I see contingent pacifism as lining up with just war theory. I mean, it has in there, rightful intentions and it being out of necessity. It's like there's no other option. You've tried everything else.
Mm-hmm.
So personally, I think that's the stronger option when you're dealing with people or forces that are sort of equal to you in power or perhaps lesser to you in power. You have sort of this contingent pacifist approach. But when you have when you're facing a power that's sort of like absolutely superior to you in force, in a way, this sort of absolute pacifism is the best sort of take, especially if there's elements within that force that are like, fairly sympathetic and liberal. For example, like open-minded, educated people, they will see what's going on and sympathies will be gained and public opinion will be swayed eventually. So I think it really depends on the situation you find yourself in. So I think there's really room for all of these things, because even absolute pacifism, like in a sense, if you're not a country that can adequately defend itself, one of the things in just war theory is like it has to be the goal that you're trying to achieve or the war that you're trying to win. It has to be possible.
Right.
That's another component to a just war. So if you're facing forces that are ultimately superior to you, then sort of that absolute pacifist approach might be better.
Right. Because victory would be impossible under such circumstances.
Yeah, you have to create motion of ideas and sympathies and create a revolution that way. You're not going to do it by force. You don't have enough force.
Right.
So you have to almost play like a little bit of a long game.
Right. I think Gandhi and his example might be a good case in point too, because I suppose the Indian military was inferior to the British military when considering, whether or not they could ever achieve their political and moral reforms through military action or through military means. It seems unrealistic that they could have. So non-violent resistance, I think, as it was demonstrated by Gandhi, I think was probably the better moral option.
Let's just say India would never take that stance with Pakistan.
Right. Okay, I see where you're going with that line of thought.
So because it's more between an equal in power, right?
Yes, indeed. I think too, partly it's also Gandhi's actions were motivated by the ethical philosophy too, which he subscribed to, the Hindu or Vedic philosophy of nonviolence. That's a core principle within the within Indian philosophy, and whether or not it's always followed in practice is another question. But perhaps in principle, it's a good principle to follow in situations where it can be followed. But in any case, I think those are good observations. I think, again, too, we seem to largely agree on the question of pacifism and whether it's a better alternative to war. It seems like we're both saying something like sort of a middle ground approach might be the best approach. At least it might be the best we have for now. It's also whether what kind of pacifism we adopt depends on the situation. So those are the key questions I wanted to focus on for our discussion. And I'm pretty much at the limit of what I wanted to say. So if there's nothing else you want to chime in with, Ryan, I thought we could just bring our discussion to a summary.
Summarize it up.
All right. Sounds good. Well, to bring our discussion to summation, we've discussed the nature of war in three of its key aspects: its metaphysical, psychological, and political nature. We've offered our own assessments regarding the theses that we have presented. We've offered our own arguments and evidence in support of these theses that war has metaphysical, psychological, and political dimensions. We considered the necessary relationship and unity between the opposites of war and peace, and suggested how this unity of opposites of principle plays out across the multiple dimensions of war. And hopefully this discussion has shed light on the nature of war, its causes, and how war and peace are necessarily connected, at least in some contexts and from a certain point of view. And I'll admit that our discussion has by no means gotten to the bottom of these issues, and that a deeper investigation would help us assess the truth of what we've discussed. But we've laid out the groundwork for such a discussion by examining the salient issues to this discussion in some breadth. So thank you for your time and attention and listening to this discussion. And in the meantime, be sage. Thanks for listening.